if I swipe to the right now, I see Ritvik, Professor Sangi, Vipin, and Atul.
Yes.
Greetings.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we should start now. Should we? We have enough people, right?
I think we definitely have a quorum.
Yeah, the only problem I have is that I have to manually add people. So I'll just be a little distracted, but I'll start anyway. Okay, so I made some notes.
Do it.
So welcome all of you to join our first online session of the Lunchbox Philosophers. Today's topic is the meaning of happiness. Now, as I was researching, and I've read a lot about this, almost every philosopher has something to talk about happiness. So it becomes a very expansive topic. So one of the first points I wanted to bring into this discussion was the sort of the sense in which the word happiness itself is used, because I think that would be a good starting point to get some clarity.
Can you spell out the topic first?
Yes.
The topic. What is the topic?
The topic is meanings of happiness.
Okay.
Yes, and I would request everyone to mute themselves so that whenever you want to talk, you can unmute. Yes, so that there's no static noise. All right. So I'll take 5 minutes to go through, sort of touch the home bases because I don't want to spend too much time talking. The first thing that we need to understand is happiness is used in two senses of the term. One is a well-being sense, which is the sense that has been historically used. Rajesh sir, could you mute yourself for the time being?
Yeah, I don't know how to mute myself. This is wait.
Okay. Yeah. So.
Yeah.
In the sense of the biggest philosophers in history have talked about happiness in terms of well-being, which is how to live a good life. Where there is also this sense, which is much newer, which is more of a scientific sense, which recognizes happiness as a psychological state and deals with it in a purely descriptive sense. So it needs to be asked, what is it when we talk about happiness? What exactly are we referring to? Are we referring to it as a descriptive state, which talks about the concept of what is good for the person, for that person, a psychological state. So happiness, which is good for that person, or the well-being sense of the term, which is what is good, not for the person, but what is good in general. So that is the basic senses in which the term differs in these two areas. Now we can go down, we can touch on many ideas under both. So let us begin with certain simpler ideas. One of the major ideas to explain happiness is hedonism. This idea basically talks about every individual wants to maximize their pleasures, right? So some of the famous hedonists come under classical utilitarianism, for example. They believe that we need to maximize our utility, which is based purely on pleasure, the maximizing of pleasure and the minimizing of pain. So let's move on to another theory. I just, because I don't want to take all the time. So there's this basic difference between what is good for me versus what is good. So this is basically the definition which we need to grapple with. Which one to use and what are we using when we mean happiness? So let's just begin with this. I would encourage people to join this discussion and kind of explain what they think of happiness. Is it what is the good, the general sort of good, more in the well-being sense of the term when they think about it? Or is it what is good for them? Is it more like a state of a psychological state, perhaps? So I'll just open it to discussion. Anyone? All right. So if anyone wants to discuss, they need to raise their hand. So if they can just go at the bottom right-hand side, I think, and there is a raise hand option, right? Can someone help me with this?
Yeah, if you are using phone, there is an option at the bottom, right? There are 3 dots more. You go on that, and then there's an option of raising your hand.
Right. So if anyone wants to talk, they can raise their hands, and I will recognize them through that. All right. I'll just move on if I need to give a better description. There are certain theories under both of these umbrellas. So one of the theories is hedonism, as I talked, which comes under the psychological state. Then there is this theory called life satisfaction theory, which talks about the satisfaction of it's different from hedonism in the sense that well, I can't remember what it exactly says. There is another theory called emotional state theory, which talks about the value of emotional states in our lives. So, for example, moods that we might have. So we might explain happiness in terms of moods. So it is not clear how a mood would be different than, say, an experience of pleasure. They're fundamentally different things, and it's not clear how one would choose one over the other. In the sense of a mood, you can think of, for example, a mood of depression, for example. It's a more scientific way of thinking about it. There, it's not pretty much clear why a mood itself has any value or is good. Whereas pleasure is seen to have an intrinsic value to the individual. There are certain fundamental concepts when we discuss these things that come up. One of them is that of intrinsic versus extrinsic value. So again, it touches again on this concept of good versus good force. I just want to be very clear. Intrinsic is something, an intrinsic value is something that is good for you in a very basic sense. It's almost as if it is good for someone for its own sake, that it's not explainable in some other terms. For example, if I were to say, why is love good for you? If you could somehow tell me, well, love is good for you because it helps you do this, this, this. So there is a good for argument there. So you can shift the importance to another reason when you're discussing about the goodness of love. But there are certain qualities when you can't do that anymore, right? So those would be intrinsic values, and they have somehow the most fundamental importance in philosophy. Philosophers give them special attention. Can someone help me here? If you have anything to say, please jump in at any time. There's just so much.
I just have a couple of questions.
Yes.
Well, first of all, you appear to think that moods don't have any value, and yet one could question that. Moods do have value. Whether I'm depressed or happy, for example, to take one binary that you proposed, is surely very important. And it does have value for me. And then secondly, the happiness as well-being versus just being happy. I mean, I don't understand the difference there. Are you defining happiness as well-being? Well, because I could think, I could say one of the meanings of happiness is a state of well-being, a physical, mental, emotional, financial well-being. And if one is in a state of well-being, one has at least fulfilled the minimum necessary conditions for being happy. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, so it's using the term, so these are not contradicting things. So when you use the term happiness in the sense of well-being of an individual,
Yeah.
Yes, you're talking, well, yes, there also you're talking in some sense what is good for the person. But
Well, it's not someone else who legislates what's good for the person. The person decides, I am in a state of physical well-being. I am in a state of financial abundance, or at least of well-being. I'm in a
yes,
state of emotional, mental well-being. Therefore, I'm happy.
Yes.
Overall, I'm happy.
But
Yeah.
some philosophers would not agree with that. So, for example, Aristotle would disagree with you. He would say that there are certain things that make you happy in the sense that they give you pleasure and the individual likes it, but it is no good because he makes a value judgment. Yes, so the difference would be between these two senses of the term is in one place, in the psychological state of mind that you're talking about, there's no value judgment. It is what makes me happy. Whereas on the other side, on the more
Or
philosophical
what gives
side,
me well-being, that sense of well-being.
yeah. So, but there's no value
Yeah.
judgment there. Yes. So I think that is the crux of it. So on the other side, it's the value judgment.
Not so fast. I think there is a value judgment there, because what counts as a positive state of well-being for me may not count as a positive state of well-being for Vipin, or for Ritvik, or for Professor Sanghi or Manohar.
Yes. I mean,
Yeah.
but it's not imposed as a top-down sort of, so to speak, right? It's the individual himself who says that, but there's no theory to say that it is the good thing. It's just good for that
No,
person.
there's a very important thing which has been proved scientifically,
Right.
that happiness is related to mental health. It has been proved. So you can't say that it's a value judgment, that what is good for me is not good for somebody else. Happiness is an essential requirement like oxygen and water.
Well, yes. To answer that, the point of this was to differentiate, to sort of bifurcate the definition of happiness, of what it means, in a way that this this contradiction doesn't come, right? So I could say that when I say happiness in the psychological state of mind term, then what you're saying will be valid. However, philosophers would disagree with you if you were to say that, if you use this explanation to say that it should be the way virtue is defined for a virtuous life. For them, the reasoning would be more independent of the person. So, for example,
No,
Aristotle.
Yeah. Okay, Ujjwal, one thing. It's not just a state of mind, because the state of mind also affects the state of health. So there's a physical ramification also to it.
Yes.
I mean, you can be unhappy and not healthy. So therefore, you can't say that it's just because it's only in the mind. Because the mind is affecting the body. After all, what is controlling the functions of the human body? It is the mind.
Right.
Whether it's blood circulation, whether it's anything. Mind makes a lot of healing, for example. It's a known fact that medicines will work better if you are positive about it.
Right.
If you want to get well.
Well, that's a good point.
And Manohar, just to support you, there's also the placebo effect, which even doctors are admitting, that if I strongly believe that a medicine, even a sugar pill, will work to cure my cancer or to heal me of COVID-19, it may very well work. So that's the placebo effect. The mind does have a powerful role to play in terms of the physical healing of the body.
Ujjwal, I
It's
would
not
like
all
to...
there is. I mean, I certainly think one shouldn't stop taking one's medications or doing chemotherapy or taking whatever drugs are now available for COVID-19 or whatever else. But I think the state of mind of the patient is certainly an important contributing fact to her recovery. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, that's in line with what you were saying, Manohar.
Yeah. And I just want to refer to one article I've written very recently. I'll probably send a link of it over here only. It's about microvita. Virus is nothing but a positive and a negative microvita. And a microvita, which means the healing, overcoming a virus. A virus is a negative microvita. And if your mind and thinking can generate a positive microvita, you can overcome. So viruses cannot, not always medicines which work on it. It's also the state of mind. Actually, it has been proved scientifically that the state of mind can actually physically affect the virus, which means the negative microvita.
I have a question to
provided
that.
your mind generates positive microvita.
Yes. I have a question. So I think what is being overlooked in all of this discussion, I actually agree with everything you've said, is this small distinction. It is, what do you mean by happiness? I mean, that is the question, right? What's the term? So you have laid out all these reasons that it enables your happiness, right? Even Raj sir has talked about it. But what is happiness? So I think my question was trying to make a minor distinction in that. And I would say that I'm a little at a loss for words. I'm sorry. It's a little
Ujjwal, can I add something?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So your question that what is happiness?
Yes.
So like I was recently, reading an article in the Hindu newspaper, and when I read that article, I felt that actually it's true. When we experience it in our level. So what I read there was like, so they said like, for example, everything in this world is made up of atoms and electrons and right? Small particles, and particles in themselves are not happy or not happy, right? How can a combination of particles make you happy? So there's the argument which they were trying to make is that happiness, which everyone is claiming is a state of mind, or something which rises in the brain, is kind of a neuron function. That's not true. Rather, it's a kind of rather it's points to a deeper reality. So that's what I read in the Hindu article, it's not something which is created in the brain or something like that. But yes, it points out to a different reality. So because
That's a good point. That's
atoms,
a good point.
they cannot.
Yeah. So in all these scientific experiments, how would you measure happiness? You would have self-reports, right? So that was the point I was going to be making. I forgot about it. So a patient goes through treatment, for example, and then he reports his happiness. Is there any other way? Is there another way to I forgot.
If I may chip in at this point in time, I'm Srajan.
Yeah, please.
I think
Please.
I hear it. I'm happy to hear.
Yeah.
So I think that the previous speaker is trying to make that greater point to what Descartes made between mind-body dualism, as in like mind is different from the brain. So in the sense that some of what happiness feels like, you can calculate dopamine levels, and clinical depression is scannable, but not all moods and all shades of happiness are very, they're not empirically scannable, at least as of now. Like if I'm happy after watching a movie and then I'm driving back to the home and there's traffic, I'm not that happy. Those different like slight variations are not exactly scannable, at least as of now. Until there's clinical depression is scannable and some things are scannable empirically, but not all shades of human moods are scannable. And we don't even know if there is a spectrum, or if what you feel as happiness and what I feel as happiness are subjectively just so different experiences that we use the same word for due to lack of vocabulary and thought. I'm just putting that in.
Right.
Okay, hi Raj. Sorry to join.
How are you?
I'm wonderful. I'm sorry I'm late. Yeah.
It's good to see you.
Great to see you.
Yeah, great to see you. It's always fun.
So I'm having a hands raised from Ritvik. Ritvik, you go, and then we'll have Ananya. So, Ritvik, you can go. Ritvik. So he's not there. Ananya, if you want to speak.
You're muted, Ritvik.
Yeah. Oh, I mistakenly
okay.
muted.
Sorry.
Okay, so for me, happiness is not an objective concept. So I don't think that I can define happiness in such a way that it would be applicable to everyone. For me, though it's a state of well-being, it's a privilege, it's short-term. Yeah. And I think that, I agree that the point which Vipin made regarding atoms and electrons, and that their happiness cannot be calculated and all. I think that that's true. I think it might have metaphysical origin. Yeah,
Right, right,
that's
right.
what I.
Yes. Now Ananya wants to speak. Please go ahead.
So I wanted to add to your point about the ways you can measure happiness. So of course, I think psychologists would probably do it through a series of questionnaires and, giving you a bunch of questions. But what they're really probing is how well, I don't know, how well you're able to function in your daily life. So I think one good way to measure happiness for your own self could be how well you are able to adapt in your environment, how well you, I don't know, are able to interact with the different components of your environment. And yeah, because personally, I feel an indicator of, I don't know, non-happiness would be that you're no longer comfortable in your immediate environment. Of course, this is in the case of I don't know, immediate happiness. Of course, if you're talking about happiness on a more metaphysical level, then yeah, I think it can be different. But
So you just said,
also,
yeah. No, please go ahead. Yeah, please finish.
yeah. Also, I wanted to lay out a distinction between the immediate chemical response that you feel, for instance, when you're happy, versus a more holistic view of happiness. For instance, you may have a long-term goal that you want to move towards, but you also have a short-term, like you also have an immediate life that you want to live. You may feel that you're not perfectly happy in this particular life, and you may want to work towards your long-term goal, of course. But the fact that you're moving towards it contributes to your holistic happiness. I think that is something that you may feel when you go to a, I don't know, to a spiritual center or go traveling or go to the hills, whatever you intrinsically like. But also an immediate happiness, I think I would simply think of it as, yeah, I would think of it as a chemical response. But it's a more stagnant chemical response. Like pleasure is something that spikes up, but happiness is more like a stagnant line that you feel perhaps for a couple of days. It kind of stays the same. And I think I would like to think of happiness in a more holistic sort of view. But I think we can also discuss about joy. I think Raj sir would like to.
How very perceptive of you, Ananya, because I just wanted to talk about that distinction between happiness and joy, or between
Yeah.
santosh, contentment, and ananda.
Yeah.
Ananda in Sanskrit means joy. It's not bliss. It's often mistranslated from Sanskrit as bliss, but ananda really means that overwhelming joy of being. And it's seen as one of the attributes of Brahman, the ultimate reality in Hinduism. The idea that this joy overflows. It's a state of being. It's not based on external factors at all. You could be dying and still in a state of joy. You could be well or sick, loved or unloved, and still in a state of joy. You're not necessarily happy. You don't have the requisite chemical responses to your environment that would qualify as happiness. You're not even happy in a holistic sense necessarily because your life is crumbling around you, but you could still be in a state of joy. That's the paradox. So joy is really a transcendent state. It's something that that is very available to all of us, and yet it transcends happiness. And it transcends external material conditions for what makes us happy, such as health and wealth and being loved and all that. But I also want to take Ujjwal's discussion earlier. He mentioned Aristotle to have one very important concept in Aristotle. Aristotle sneers at pleasure, sneers at the hedonists. And there were many hedonists in his time. He talks instead about eudaimonia. And eudaimonia is a state of satisfaction, of overflowing fullness, completeness. It is a sense of great strength, fullness, joy, abundance in all areas, a sense of overflowing. That is eudaimonia. Has anyone experienced that? I think it's very close to what I call joy, except Aristotle also believes that there are material factors that are important. You need to have a certain amount of wealth, you need to have a certain amount of health, you need to have a good education in order to qualify for eudaimonia, just as you do for pleasure or happiness. But has anyone experienced joy or that sense of overflowing? Sense of flourishing. Aristotle also talks about flourishing. That's his abundance in all areas of life. Flourishing.
Before we go any further, I'm going to send over a link in the chat, right? Because I think we're reaching the 45-minute mark, I think. 40 minutes.
Because I just got a message saying this meeting no longer has a time limit.
Yeah.
Is that true?
One of us hit the jackpot. One of us hit the jackpot. I think, Ujjwal, somebody with an unlimited Zoom account joined in. Maybe it was Vish.
Okay. Right.
No, that message came before Vish.
That person, we got an unlimited free ride. So we can talk till midnight.
Amazing.
So Zoom has started doing it.
Clicking any further links.
Please go ahead,
Zoom
sir.
started doing this for educational institutions. So, Ujjwal, are you using IIIT Delhi account?
No, I'm not using IIIT Delhi, no.
Because they are selectively giving free service to educational institutions.
No. So I guess some participant must have had a subscription or something. Or maybe everyone else is using their IIIT Delhi. I don't know.
Well, yeah, that's possible. And also Professor Vish just walked in, and right after that, we got the message saying the meeting no longer has a limit. So Vish, I think you're a VIP in the eyes of the Zoom admin.
Right.
Either that or you're using your IIIT account.
No, actually Zoom is trying to throw these carrots at people so that, because Google Meet is unlimited. And now Geo has also come out with Geo Meet, which is unlimited. Therefore, Zoom has to stay in the competition.
Geo Meet is horrible.
I mean, Zoom has to stay in the competition.
But Google Meet is not horrible.
Google Meet is
Google
good.
Meet.
Yeah.
Google Meet is good, but not as good as Zoom. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
Let me put it this way. Geo is a pleasurable app. Google Meet is a joyful act.
Google gives you ananda.
Right. See, I go back to my old statement of W.H. Davis's poem, Joy and Pleasure. Right? Joy begets you happiness, pleasure does not. Pleasure looks at what others react to. Joy looks at what I respond to. There is no question of reaction in happiness. There is only a response in happiness, right? That is exactly why I cannot give a measure of happiness. You can't. I can give you a measure of my pleasure because that's a reaction, right? It's like saying, flowing water, what shape does it have? It has no shape. You restrict it, it gets a shape. Happiness has no restriction. Joy has no restriction. It doesn't look at what will my neighbors say. It doesn't look at, hey, what will Raj say? Right? Or what will Dheeraj say? Or what will Vipin say? No. It does exactly what it wants to do. That's where happiness lies. That you cannot measure it. You cannot take a reaction to it. This is how I measure. It needs to be a little selfish at the end of it. Right? If you have no self, there is no happiness. I don't know how much of you would agree.
I would like to ask one question from you, Vish. Isn't pleasure associated with body senses? And happiness is more cerebral.
See, that is
Like
why I made a statement Yeah, that's why I made a statement about response and reaction. Cerebral is never a reaction. To me, cerebral is always a response, right? In that sense of it, yes, happiness is cerebral in all its content.
Right. Okay. So I will take it from this. So a brief summary of what we've discussed. I think we've established some form of a distinction between well-being, which is a good life. We've distinguished it from happiness, right? So well-being is itself its own kind of thing, whereas this happiness, almost in this more descriptive sense of the term, what we feel is another, right? Is another thing. So we've established that distinction, so we can move forward with that distinction. I think it's a very good distinction to make, so that when we talk about, say, a good life, we can just talk about something which is more about. Am I right? Does anyone disagree with me on this conclusion from this debate till now? That I can give a prudential value almost to well-being. Manohar sir, you've raised your hand. Please go ahead. I think it was an older hand. All right, so let's move forward. Why don't we switch to the concept of well-being? I mean, it is a sense in which happiness has been talked about for centuries, right? So if we talk about that in the sense that what is in terms of what is good for you to live a good life, it is not just in terms of say pleasures or some cerebral effect, which we have discussed is also a way to look at happiness. But let's, for the moment, move on this particular pathway. So one of the challenges to the notion of the good for that I talked about in the beginning versus what is good was given by this this sort of it's called the Moore's challenge. So what it talks about is, imagine there's a painting, right? Imagine it has some aesthetic value and it's kept in a world. That world has nothing else, just that painting, right? So then the question is, what is the value of that world which contains this one thing? And we've assumed that this painting, it's a beautiful painting, it only has aesthetic value, which is not good for the painting. The painting cannot have anything good for itself. That doesn't make sense. So it is something that's just considered good, right? So then we ask the question, what is the value of this world? And intuitively, it seems plausible to say that the value of this world is the value of the painting itself, because that is all it contains. So therefore, in this sense, we've established that the good is the intrinsic value here of this world, the good. There's no good for here. Now take another case. There's a world and there is a person who resides in this world, the only person who lives a life good for that person, right? So now this is the good for distinction, which is, as we've discussed so far, sort of this almost personal sense, or, you know, related to the person who's experiencing that particular thing. Then we ask a question, in this world, what is the relationship between the value of the world and the value for the life that P lives, or the life, the value that the life gives to P living in this world, right? So then we again go to the same logic. Does this world have any value at all, right? The only value it seems to contain is a good for value for now. So there's a life within this world which is good for a person, right? We don't have an intrinsic value yet. Good for values are sort of extrinsic in the sense that because they're good for something, that there's another reason for them to be good, that they're almost extrinsic in some sense because they're dependent on another thing. So, so then we ask the question, what about the goodness, the only good value of this world? We would like to say that this world has some good value in comparison to an empty world. I mean, that is one of our assumptions. Say there's an empty world and this is a world where there's this person who has, you know, a life which is good for him. So this assumption is that this world cannot have a null goodness total, right? It must have some value. So, well, it must be that the world has to be good because of the good it contains for the individual. Now, see what we did there. This is part of this challenge. It's kind of almost like a wordplay. It took me a while to understand it. I'll repeat the sentence. This world has to be good because of the good it contains for the individual. So this is nothing violating what we already said, right? However, this fails to capture the idea that there is in fact nothing of value in this world except what is good for the individual. Considering, because we started with the idea that good and good for are different things, right? We started with that. So now we've proven by contradiction in this, at least in Moore's eyes, that good for does not exist. So till now what we have discussed, even Raj sir has talked about, and many of us have talked about this happiness in terms of what is good for me, right? Moore kind of turns it on its head and says, the hell with good for, there's no sense in that. It is only the good, the intrinsic good, which doesn't have to be good for a person necessarily. It has to be good. So the question has totally changed in a philosophical sense, in a logical sense. I hope you all understood this sort of proof by contradiction example. There have been many challenges to this. This Moore's challenge. But it is, and one of the challenges is this. One way to resolve this sort of contradiction is simple, which is that, well, the world doesn't need to be better than an empty world necessarily. So in the middle, if you listen, that was one of the assumptions that we used, that it has to be better than an empty world, because the fact that it has a life, well, we can just assume that that is good for someone, and that is a sufficient enough reason. We can just stop there. Then the contradiction does not happen, right? So that is one of the challenges to move. So what I'm trying to say is that there is this debate between what is good for an individual, what is good, period, and what is good for a person. For example, I'll just say what's the difference. Honesty, for example. Is honesty a good value? Will it generally bring happiness, or is it related to well-being? Or is it good in the case when it is not good for an individual? For example, being honest is not good for me in that situation. It does not benefit me. So in that sense, we've been talking about good for and good. So we'll move from that. Does anyone have any thoughts about this distinction? I think this is sort of the distinction in the definition.
You know, Ujjwal, I do have a question.
Right.
That this whole concept of intrinsic value is highly dubious. No, it's something that
right.
we need to be very skeptical about ever since Nietzsche. As good post-structuralists, as good postmodernists, I don't think we can afford to subscribe to this sort of Platonic concept of intrinsic value. I mean, what is the inherent goodness of a painting? If the whole world is wiped out tomorrow,
yeah.
You know, would Picasso's Guernica have any inherent value?
Yes.
Would a painting by Monet still have inherent value?
Yes.
I don't think you can distinguish value from value for whom.
Yes.
So if there is no value for anyone, I doubt that it has value at all. So to say, in a world that is completely devoid of human beings and human valuation, that honesty is a value is meaningless. Try saying that to the asteroids. Try saying that to the cosmic dust.
Yes.
Say that to Sirius. You know, A cold emptiness answers you.
Yes, yes.
There is no other reply.
Yes. Well, Aristotle would completely disagree with you. I can give you his logic so that everyone knows.
Those are all the intrinsic.
I understand.
Plato,
But,
Aristotle, so
yes,
forth.
but there's something to be learned, I guess, in this debate of two because in Aristotle's mind, the fact that if something is good, but it's good because it's good for something else, like there's a consequence which is the good, then this first thing, its value decreases in terms of importance given or preference given, right? It has an extrinsic value.
Given by someone, by a human entity.
Well, yes.
Or by a certain kind of animal entity. You could say that the dog values his dog biscuits. And to that extent, the dog is a primitive evaluating instrument. And so dog biscuit does have a certain goodness for the dog. But to say that my dog Cleo has, considers this biscuit to be valuable and salivates whenever I produce this treat does not mean that the dog biscuit has any value in and of itself. If there were no dogs, biscuits would only.
I think I would go about it differently. So the question here is different. So if I say the dog biscuit is good for the dog, okay? So then I will ask, why is the dog biscuit good for the dog? So I will say, okay, it must be good for the dog because it helps the health of the dog or it cures his hunger. So that's the next good quality that I've jumped to. Okay. Then I ask the question. Then I ask the question.
If I were to say the dog biscuit cures Cleo's hunger, therefore it is good in itself, what exactly do I mean?
No, I'm not saying that. I haven't said that. No.
To satisfy.
Let me just complete. So, okay. So let me complete. So then we ask the question, okay, it's good for his health. Okay. So why is something that is good for your health good? So basically you go into this this regressive logic. And the question is, if you reach that point where you cannot say any longer that this thing is good because another thing exists, then this is sort of the source of the goodness. And that is, it has intrinsic value. Whereas all the values that preceded in this sort of stream of logic have this extrinsic value, which is derived from this source, right? So because it is derived, it has a certain lesser of a preference given in terms of, and this intrinsic value is given a heightened sort of a preference in terms of its value.
No, but where does this intrinsic value come from? I mean, I repeat the challenge. If there were no Cleo and if there were no other dog, what value would this dog biscuit have? None. Zero. And if there were no intelligent beings, intelligence in the sense in which we define intelligence, not, let's say, an intelligent amoeba on Sirius, but if there were no intelligent life to evaluate that dog biscuit, who would be there to say this dog biscuit is valuable? Biscuit valuable for who? It's inherently valuable in the coldness of the void?
I don't, it's a good question.
So for me, there is nothing except relative extrinsic value. There's no such animal as intrinsic value. It's always value for Deepak or value for me or value for you or value for Ananya.
So Ananya has her hand raised. Ananya, you can go ahead if you want to say something.
So precisely the question that you had raised, whether a void world or a world with just one painting, which looks very beautiful, they're both equal. If you don't have anybody to evaluate the goodness or whatever that means of the world.
Can you repeat the question? Is it a question?
So you had posed the question that whether, let's say, you have one world which does not have anything and another world which has a painting which looks very beautiful. So I would say that they're both at the same level. They both have the same amount of goodness.
Yeah.
Because again, when we stray away from Aristotle's view of inherent goodness, which I don't know, in this world it does not exist, because we have so many perspectives now that it makes zero sense to attribute goodness to any object anymore.
Yeah.
We may have a common consensus on a couple of things, like art. A lot of people enjoy it, a lot of people don't, but we have a common consensus, so we believe, okay, yeah, it must be good. Maybe I don't get it, but there is no inherent goodness. So
Yeah.
according
Yeah.
to me, both the worlds would have the
Yeah.
same level of goodness.
Yeah, actually, that's a very good question, because when I was reading about Moore's challenge, it was an assumption he made. He said, assume for the sake of argument that that because that painting is the only thing in that world, that if it has value, then that world as a result has a value. And he said that that's an has intuitive plausibility. So you've totally hammered that intuitive plausibility. So that's a good point, I think. Yes, you're right.
Yeah. But how this could be extended would be, assuming we have these two worlds, right? And assuming that we have an observer.
Yes.
Then the other world offers more probabilities for enjoying or not enjoying the world, because there is an object. This object could actually cause happiness or sadness to XYZ person.
Yeah.
So in that way, this world is slightly more advanced than the void, which I don't know, may not trigger a lot of synapses in the brain for like anybody to experience, but yeah, inherently.
I think you explained it better than I did. I also, when I was saying the challenge to Moore's challenge was this, that it doesn't have to be necessary that the world has to have any value against an empty world just because there's a person inside. And in that argument, it was implicit that we can just assume that it is good enough for us, that it does not have any value, and the person in it doesn't good for value in that world is enough for us to like that world. So I think it is a similar formation of just what you said, introduced sort of a perspective which was lacking before, which was just filled with assumptions. It's a good point. Great point.
But Ananya, aren't you also saying that the world which has an observer seems to have slightly more value than the void? But who makes that judgment? Surely it is the observer. And this is something that G.E. Moore would never agree with, Ujjwal. If you read Principia Ethica, where Moore, who was a contemporary of Bertrand Russell and A.N. Whitehead, Moore actually argues that there is a difference between good and the good. The good could be as instrumental, as relative, etc., as we please. But he contends, and this is very Platonic, this is more at his Neoplatonic best or worst, the idea that there is an inherent good, a capital G good, which cannot be defined, which cannot be reduced to anything other than itself. Would you agree with that, Ujjwal?
Yes, I would. I think it's
in terms of my characterization of Moore in Principia Ethica.
Yes. But the challenge that was raised in terms of perspective, that was a challenge to Moore. So he might not agree with that, but that's exactly.
No, he would not agree with that. I think he would say that applies to the good. That the perspectival challenge applies to the good, whereas good, capital G, is independent of perspective.
Oh, yes. Because
good in itself, it's intrinsically good. Yeah.
So you've brought back in his assumption, which was that the painting itself has an so he would give more preference to the good versus the good for. Yeah, I understand.
And I'm not sure that he would go as far as paintings. I mean, Moore was a very austere character. He doesn't really bring in considerations of aesthetics there. So he doesn't talk about the goodness of paintings. It's always the goodness of human beings or actions. So he wants to confine his definition of good to non-aesthetic moral goodness. So, it's more the goodness of motive or character or personality or whatever that he seems to be addressing in Principia Ethica, which is why the book is called Principia Ethica.
Yeah, I think in the challenge he was just trying
and
to
not
make a point.
Principia Aesthetica, for example.
Yeah, I think it won't make it. It's principally it's the same argument he would make. I think.
Yeah.
This is just an
I'm not
example.
so sure about that. I really don't think Moore was an absolutist about beauty or about other values in quite the same way in which he was about good. Somehow he has, like Plato, who in some ways was his master, an addiction to good in itself, to inherent good.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
so,
I really think that the perspective argument can challenge G.E. Moore, just as it can challenge Plato, because I think both of them are slightly out of it. You're given an Ananya scenario of the void versus an inhabited planet, where this painting has value for at least one observer. She nailed it right there. It's value for one observer. And if that observer concludes, look, my planet is better than the void, that's his or her judgment.
right.
It's not necessarily true. It's not necessarily inherently valuable. It's the judgment of that or the proposition uttered by that individual. The observer survivor on planet B as opposed to planet A, which is in the void. And by the void here, we are defining the void in a rather limited way of a planet or an astronomical entity that's devoid of life, intelligent life as we know it.
Right. All right.
Yeah.
So okay. So let's move on a little bit. So we've sort of discussed the definition sort of happiness, what it would mean. And once we've sort of settled on some of these forms, we can ask the question of what are its components? What does it consist of? One of the ideas I mentioned before, I will repeat it, is the hedonist idea, which says, it's a very simple proposition that happiness is only dependent on the sum total of pleasures and minus the pains. That itself can define the entirety of a person's happiness, right? So, but a challenge to that comes with this very interesting theory that I just wanted to mention. I think it'll be good for everyone to know about this. This is called the experience machine theory. And it talks about, there's this person, and we go with the assumption of the hedonist argument, which is that pleasure is everything, and pain is bad, pleasure is good, right? That is something that that's a proposition that most of philosophers have agreed, that pleasure is good and pain is bad, but they don't exclusively say that that's it. They always leave room. For example, Aristotle, Plato, everyone left room for other sort of higher values. But so to challenge this very strict notion of pleasure and pain in terms of defining happiness, in terms of its constituents, this experiment is, so I can have a person and I can put electrodes in his mind. So this is a thought experiment proposed by Robert Nozick. And I can put electrodes or something, nowadays we can do this, and I can stimulate his pleasure centers infinitely. I can just give him those experiences. And for the sake of this thought experiment, assume that, say, I want to write a book. I can simulate that experiment through these electric nodes or whatever, cathodes, whatever is put in his brain. I can stimulate the exact pleasure that he would get, and he would feel like as if he is doing that thing. But the truth is that in reality, he is not. That he is not actually picking a pen to write it, but he might experience that pleasure, sort of, in a virtual reality, so to speak. So Robert Nozick puts forward this sort of scenario, and he asks people. He asks the simple question: would you do it? If pleasure is all you want to maximize from a hedonist standpoint, then would you just do this? Just go and get yourself stimulated, because that is the best way to maximize pleasure, right? And minimize pain, because it's just direct. And so the answer, if you answer it in the sense that, no, actually, I would like to, actually write a novel and not just experience it in the virtual sense, then in that, when you say that, you are implicitly accepting that there are values that are also important, just as pleasure, right? So that sort of this experiment kind of refutes the strict hedonist argument. And it takes us to another theory of well-being and happiness, desire theories. So now desires come into play. So first it was just pleasures and pains, maximize pleasure and pain. We're talking about constituents of well-being or happiness in this sense. Now comes desires. So we have desire theories. Desires are particular goals. We have a number of desire theories. One is called the present desire theory. If I have a desire to do something, if I can complete that desire, it doesn't talk about necessarily pleasure. I will derive satisfaction from it. And then there is comprehensive desire theory, which talks about the overall desire satisfaction in the course of a person's life. So this is desire theory. Now, there are objective list theories, which is this third kind of theories, where whatever is being missed sort of in this list. So the list has started with pleasures, then we added desires. What else is there? So that is dealt with objective list theories. And one of the theories would be perfectionism, was proposed by I think Aristotle was a proponent of it, but many other philosophers also. So this is a basic claim that a part of well-being is any quality or sort of thing that perfects human nature, right? So these types of theories are based on intuitionist approaches, and they form a part of objective list theories. And so now I've kind of covered sort of all the major theories that exist under the realm of happiness. Now, obviously, we can get into details of each one of them. I think we are running short of time. So Rajayar sir, can you?
Well, I don't think we need to bother. We can continue till midnight. Zoom has given us endless license.
Right.
No, but yes, I mean, I think we should keep it homeopathically brief. If we overload the customers, they may not come back next week.
Yes.
They might masochistically stay on till midnight, but never again, they say. And this might be an experience that haunts their worst nightmares. But just to go back to Nozick and the pleasure machine, the experience machine. If you look at the Marquis de Sade in the 18th century, and by the way, Sade was not as wicked as he tried to paint himself to be. He was actually, a fairly confused man. But if you look at the characters that he portrays in Philosophy of the Bed, in the Bedroom, and Justine and Juliet, and his same-sex masterpiece, 120 Days of Sodom. Sade's ideal is a monastery surrounded by forests and meadows and beautiful vegetation, where people basically have sex all day long, all day and all night. I mean, these are voluptuaries who have, and it's always framed from the masculine perspective, of course. So these monks are able to get it up endlessly. So after one orgasm, they just go on to another, perhaps with a different sex object. They start with a girl they've just violated, who they've brought in from the fields, and then they, decide to screw the servant boy. So it goes on in this fashion, and it becomes tedious. You realize that he's the real father of pornography because it's a repetition of the same act over and over again. You realize how few variations there really are sexually. It's basically sex, it's basically have intercourse, it's basically have intercourse from this angle. And so once you've exhausted the angles and a few basic sex acts, he's done. But the point is, he would be very happy getting into that experience machine. He is in that experience machine. His characters are. The only thing that gives them more pleasure than having sex is philosophizing about it. In Philosophy of the Bedroom, he actually talks about, a life of voluptuousness without any moral principles. So here you have an author and his characters who are very much happiness addicts, and they define happiness as endless sex.
Yes, but he did concede that he would like to philosophize also. What if I were to take away his ability to philosophize and just this endless loop?
No, I think he would be very unhappy then.
So then that disproves this point, right? So that means that there's something
he's writing
more.
Philosophical porn. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So there's something more than just pleasure, maximizing pleasure. There are other things, whatever those may be.
Whatever it is, but the experience machine is capable of accommodating all that. It doesn't have to be one kind of pleasure. Okay, granted, Saad's initial claim for being unidimensional in his pleasure quest is not correct, because he enjoys other things, including perhaps good food, including philosophizing while he's having sex, after he's having sex, etc. But the point is, he would not necessarily agree with critics of Nozick, or with Nozick himself, who argues that such an experience machine is absurd because we don't only crave pleasure, we also have pain.
Yes.
You know, we also, Saad would say, why do you need pain? I mean, and Nozick would argue you need a certain amount of pain in order to be able to appreciate pleasure. You can't live in a pleasure bubble for 24 hours. That's the whole point against the experience machine. Nozick and other critics hold up the experience machine as a way of saying a life dedicated to pleasure is impossible. Pleasure without some counterbalancing pain is impossible. But there are people like Saad who, at least in theory, would disagree with that. They're quite happy being in that happiness machine all the time.
Well, I guess then...
whatever gives them happiness.
Yeah.
Saad's case, I think it was a combination of being able to philosophize and pontificate, as well as having sex endlessly.
Yeah. Ritvik, go ahead.
Raj,
I wanted to ask.
Marco de Sade,
Yeah.
right? You've read Ulysses.
Yeah.
James Joyce.
James Joyce. Yeah.
Yeah. The soliloquy of Molly Bloom is a happiness of frustration.
Right.
See, the whole soliloquy of Molly Bloom, which Joyce writes in Sphere of Conscience, is that an expression of joy or happiness, or is it an expression of disappointment?
Right.
But she goes on
I'm
to
not
an
sure about
imagination.
that. I think Molly's final fantasy, in Ulysses, is an intense celebration of life and of sexuality, of her sexuality, and all of her life coming together, and she suddenly becomes this sort of goddess figure at the end of Joyce's novel.
See, to me, it sounded like she was re-evaluating her life and trying to find out what gave her happiness.
Right.
And couldn't find any.
Yeah.
Whereas if you read it in isolation, it looks like she fantasizes happiness.
But at the same time, the fantasy is very real. She's just had sex with her lover, and she's there. She's talking. She has a certain fondness for Mr. Bloom, her husband.
Yeah.
But she also values sex with Blazes Boylan, her handsome, virile Irish lover. So all of that goes through her mind, and it's a kind of a post-orgasmic sense of oneness with the universe. Yeah, it's almost a mystical experience. I'm not sure that it's a fantasy. At least she wouldn't interpret it as a fantasy. I, as the outside reader, especially if I'm a Puritan reader, might want to say, yeah, that's wrong. That's bad. She's a bad girl.
To me, it's an evaluation of self. The reason I came to this is, if you are able to evaluate yourself without a bias, without fear of being critical yourself, is what happiness is.
Yeah.
The fear of facing reality,
Yeah.
the fear of will I be able to understand it is what kills happiness.
Right.
So that's why Molly Bloom's thoughts, the flow of consciousness, as George puts it,
Right.
is an expression of happiness.
Right.
I'm able to evaluate myself. I'm able to understand myself
Right.
to an extent that where I think I have no more to go.
Yeah.
Right?
Mhm.
That's what I call honesty too. Honesty is not whether Raj will accept it or not. No. Honesty is when I would accept it or not.
Right.
That's where honesty is. Honesty is not what the rest of the world thinks.
Right.
I know if the others have not read George, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's yeah. But the point, are you trying to make the point that ultimately Molly Bloom's final soliloquy, if you like, and her final experience is really a fantasy experience rather than what I'm calling a post-orgasmic mystical experience where she feels one with everything, including her husband, including her cuckolded husband, whom she's just been cheating on. Yeah.
It is exactly accepting unto oneself what one looks for, what one needs.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what Molly Bloom does in that.
Right.
Ritvik, do you have something to say? Please go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted
Please.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question. Can we categorize or define happiness the same way Mill described pleasure?
Well,
We find pleasure two ways, right? Like there's a lower kind of a pleasure and there's a higher kind.
And a higher kind of pleasure, yes. So you could
Yeah.
say that what the Marquis de Sade was aiming at was a lower pleasure, whereas a higher pleasure might be the pleasure of learning to play chess or playing chess very well. A higher pleasure might be reading James Joyce as opposed to indulging in Molly Bloom's fantasy. A higher pleasure might be taking that philosophy course, etc., etc.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the problem with Mill's thesis is that he even the higher pleasure, the test that he uses is based on an explanation of pleasure itself. That is why he is under utilitarianism. He uses, for example, he would say that based on the duration of pleasure or the intensity of pleasure, it becomes a higher pleasure versus a lower pleasure. He defines those differences in those terms, in terms of pleasure itself. So he's not denying that the basic conception or the idea that pleasure alone is happiness. I think he is well within that doctrine, I think.
Right.
And that has been refuted, for example, with to the extent that it is by Robert Nozick's experiment, because Mill also falls under the hedonistic sort of principle, which is very strict to say that happiness is only maximization of pleasures and pains and nothing else. And everything else, what you might come up with, can be explained away with pleasure, or in the way that I explained, with duration and intensity of the pleasure. But I think the argument of Robert Nozick is one of the most famous ones that kind of gives, rebukes sort of that understanding.
What about you, Vipin? You've been strangely silent through all these exchanges.
I was thinking about the experiment which he talked about. I mean, if you were to fit electrodes in the mind, and if you were to stimulate a kind of a situation in which the person will be kind of, pleased for a whole of his life, what will be the situation? So I was thinking about that. So what I think is, I remember reading a quote from Somerset Maugham. He says that if you chase pleasure single-mindedly, you will find nothing pleasing you anymore. So kind of.
Can you repeat that?
So if you chase pleasure single-mindedly, you will find nothing pleasing you anymore.
Yeah.
So I was thinking that if you you are giving the pleasurable moments continuously, the person will itself get obsessed. that's where comes that the value of pleasure is defined in terms of pain also, right?
Right.
If there is pain, then only
And that, that is seen as a common challenge to the experience machine concept, to Nozick's experience machine, is that we actually do value pain as a contrast to pleasure. We learn about pleasure through pain. Yeah, all that.
Again, another question. Raj,
Yeah.
when you say Hermann Hesse,
Yeah.
Hermann Hesse, both in Glass Bead Game
Yeah.
and in Siddharth,
Right.
right, which are two extremes.
Yeah.
Physical pleasure to an intellectual pleasure.
Right.
Is he trying to put across the concept of pleasure and how it works?
Yeah.
Then in both of them, in both Glass Bead Game and in Siddharth, to learn, to experience, to look in words is what he looks at as pleasure, a joyous pleasure.
Yeah.
And not pleasure at the skin level.
Right. And that's really more akin to joy.
Yeah.
In the sense of Ananda. It is something that's found within. Yeah.
That's what W.S. Davis does too.
Yeah.
Right? Probably, if the others haven't read Hermann Hesse, you want to read it.
Right.
Siddharth has a bad reputation in the sense that the reason why it is considered to be read is because it is by a courtesan. But that's for there are a lot more philosophers than that.
Right.
And so is Glass Bead. And if you want to be a teaching faculty or a research faculty, read Glass Bead Game.
Do we have a topic for next week, Ujjwal?
So we still have to decide that. I mean, I do have a couple of suggestions if you'd like. Do you want to hear them? One, I've been fascinated with the philosophy of anger. Anger, that's one of them.
Yeah, and Lars Svensson and various others do talk about the philosophy of anger and the philosophy of fear and so forth. Yes.
Yes. And I thought of a few more. I can't remember them right now. That was the one that I remember. But we can also continue this discussion. I mean, so as I discussed a lot of concepts today, I mean, there are still a lot of outstanding concepts in terms of happiness. For example, we did not address a whole lot of things. For example, I mean, perhaps we could see this as a self-sufficing sort of one discussion. I mean, we don't have to continue it, but I mean, there's still a lot.
But Ujjwal, I hate to prick this bubble, but we've ignored the elephant in the living room, and that is the whole Corona crisis. It's almost as if we've been conducting this discussion in denial of COVID-19, which has been delightful because it's taken my mind off all this nonsense and got it back to where it belongs in terms of philosophical arm wrestling. But don't you think we should address philosophy and the coronavirus? Because there's been an awful lot. If you look at the European Journal of Psychoanalysis, there's a philosopher's corner where philosophers like Nossi and Agamben, Giorgio Agamben, some of the contemporary European philosophers have discussed the philosophy and the coronavirus, how it's used to create a state of exception, how it could be used by right-wing autocrats to create a state of dictatorship, how the shrinking of body spaces you cannot relate to the other in his or her full physicality only through the mediation of a mask or through digital mediation like this. The only way I can take off my mask and talk to you and even lean forward in an intimate gesture towards the screen is through the mediation of Zoom. But if we were sitting together, we would have to sit so many meters apart. We would be physically distanced. the body of myself and of the other is seen as a threat.
Yeah,
And that does something to the lived body. It does
Yes.
something psychologically, it does something philosophically, phenomenologically. There is so much at stake and so much that has been sacrificed. The so-called new normal, the so-called new abnormal, as I call it, is really an inversion of values. It's an inversion. It's an overturning of the lived body. It's an impoverishment of experience. It can be read at several different levels. And I can send you some articles by philosophers like Agamben and Nossi and others from the European Journal of Psychoanalysis. And we could have a discussion of that, or we could continue this, wrap up this discussion of happiness and get into philosophy and the coronavirus. How's that?
I think it's a great
Is that
idea.
possible?
It is possible. Yeah, sure. I think we should do that as a second session. I think philosophy of coronavirus. It was on my mind, but it, as did many things, it slipped from my mind today. I could have touched briefly on it.
But this is great. This is really great because it creates a sense of continuity with the past. The past, in much happier times, we would discuss things like happiness.
Yeah. So let's, we can do that.
At the live Lunchbox sessions, we wouldn't be getting into the grimness of corona reality. We would be talking about other stuff. So this is good. This is like a reminder of the past, building that continuity, introducing newcomers like Dhruv and others to this whole process of discussion. But maybe we should go further. Dhruv, what do you think? We haven't heard a yip out of you through the whole session. Deepak.
Yes, sir. So I the road next to me is quite noisy, as you can hear vehicles are still whizzing past.
Right.
But whatever I had to say, I was typing it in the comments. And thanks Ujjwal for initiating this. Going to what Raj sir was saying, like today, I think we take happiness as speaking for myself, I would take happiness as something that is within me, and I'm chipping off at layers to discover this happiness, which is intrinsic, which exists within me. So in order to do this, I am recognizing the layers that I don't need in life, probably different aspects of life that, it's this falsification towards the targets and boundaries that other people have set in society, that I need to achieve this by this age, or I need to do this by this age. There is a very clear generalization of things to achieve in order to attain happiness, or happiness can be measured in the amount of materialistic things that piles up in life. But for me, I think being involved with some aspects of spirituality and some aspects of philosophy, I've fortunately during the lockdown, I've been watching this show called Upanishad Ganga, which was playing on DD National. It picks up certain principles or certain ideas that are mentioned in the Upanishad, and it gives a very nice dramatized retelling of a particular incident, and it quotes from different texts like the Bhagavad Gita, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, from the Upanishads itself, and the lives of different poets like Mirabai, etc. So for me, happiness is a state of mind that I realize that, okay, since I have discarded A, B, and C, I have come closer to discovering happiness. So that is my point of view with regards to this discussion.
And do you second the whole concept of getting into philosophy and the coronavirus next week?
Of course, yes.
Yes,
because
that's a great idea.
what we see on TV, or what I see on TV today, is this pandemic, or this situation that we're in getting blown out of proportion. It is just
Right.
fear that is being
Yeah.
promulgated or propagated to the minds
Correct.
of people. And
Without a clear, sober look at the scientific facts, and also at what language games we are playing here. There's no standing back and taking a good, solid, philosophical, meta look at the whole corona crisis. That's not been happening. Certainly not in the media. Yeah. So Ujjwal, shall we meet at the same time? Same day of the week?
Yeah, sure.
And can we? Yeah. What about this recording? Is everyone comfortable with publishing it on Facebook?
Yeah, is everyone comfortable? I mean, if you're not comfortable, please let us know. We will. We were thinking of publishing this on the Friends Who Like Lunchbox Philosophers. It's a pretty exclusive group. I mean, it's not.
Yeah.
But if we won't, if you don't want us to. I mean, there's no. Yeah. If you have any objections, we would not publish it. Or if anyone were to reach out to me and tell me that they are not comfortable, then we will see to that. So please let us know.
Yeah.
Not comfortable about what? Sorry, I missed.
Publishing this video. So I've recorded sort of this discussion so that people know what Lunchbox is about. On the Facebook group, Friends Who Like Lunchbox Philosophers. So it is like 600 members, right? All IIIT Delhi members. Yeah.
No, there are others as well. There are lots of people.
Oh yeah,
shipping
mostly
from
IIIT
Germany, from
alumni.
France, from the US.
Yeah. So it's still an exclusive group to some. It's not a very big group, so we could publish this. We want your consent before we can do that. So.
Well, I think silence implies consent.
Yeah.
There you are. And I think this was a very good discussion. This is a very good appetite
precursor, I think.
Precursor, and we put this up on Facebook. It gives people a solid taste of what the Lunchbox discussions are like.
Yes.
Only through the medium of a virtual meeting. But yes, and many more might join in next time. And I think for philosophy and the coronavirus, we're going to get a lot of takers.
I think so, yes.